Yeah, very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks so much as well for your patience and bearing with us because we have live streaming available, and we had some technical issues to fix before we could start into the debate. Yeah. Just as a introductory remark, we are having this panel today about feminist foreign policy in Latin America, debating with our four distinguished guests that I will present to you in a very short while. In the marks of the UN conference, CSW, the conference of the Commission of the Status of Women, that is run these days in the UN headquarters in New York. And we, as Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, decided to have this panel virtually to engage with civil society actors and academics and feminists and activists globally that might not have the chance to be present at the conference in New York. And yeah, this kind of like dialogue with activists is quite important to us as a foundation. So just for those of you that do not know the foundation yet, it's called Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, or foundation. It's headquartered in Berlin and Bonn in Germany, and we have like around 100 offices all around the globe, and also in the four countries that we will be discussing today. So we have offices in Mexico City, in Sao Paulo, Bogota, and Santiago de Chile, whereas also the majority of our speakers is based at right now. And just, yeah, briefly, the foundation is dedicated to social justice, and among that also, of course, gender justice, fair labor. Yeah, we welcome you all to this panel. And I am Zina Musfeld, and I will be moderating the session today. Just to give a brief overview about the structure of this hour and a half, now a little bit less, that we're going to spend together today. We're going to have like about half an hour of introduction presentations of our four panelists, and then about half an hour to debate three questions together. And then we have about half an hour again to open the floor to you, to the audience, to ask your questions. So we really welcome any questions and maybe also comments, experience that you want to share at that during that last part of the panel. So I don't want to take any further space away of our distinguished panelists. And so we are going to start with the introductory remarks, and I'm very pleased to welcome first Dr. Constanza Jorquera, based in Chile. And yeah, she will be presenting about Chilean feminist foreign policy today. And just to introduce her briefly, Constanza is an analyst in policy and international affairs, and specializing in foreign policy, East Asian studies, and feminist foreign policy. She holds a master's degree in international studies and a PhD degree in American and international studies from the University of Santiago de Chile. And she is an academic at the University of Santiago de Chile, Diego Portales University, and Alberto Hurtado University. And she also serves as a counselor on the Foreign Policy Council of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile, and as the vice president of the Permanent Forum on Foreign Policy. So more than happy to have you with us, Constanza, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sina, and everyone at the Foundation. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor for me to share this panel with other amazing women specialists due to this new anniversary of the Beijing Platform and the Commission of the Status of Women. As Sina said, I'm going to present about it's more like a timeline of our feminist foreign policy in Chile. So if you can help me with my presentation, I will be I will say the viability of our foreign policy. So that being said, it's really important to remark that our country has a very rich experience when it comes to gender equality and foreign policy, especially in trade, in our FTA especially. But it was due to this administration of President Gabriel Boric, who announced in his campaign that one of his commitments for his administration was to launch and have a feminist foreign policy. The context of this is, of course, the feminist movements in Chile, especially during the dictatorship and after the dictatorship, different movements, especially with students in universities and schools, and what it being known as estallido social, or the social uprising in 2019, which allowed a discussion and a process of constitutional change. It failed twice, so we have the same constitution, but it opened an opportunity to discuss about the necessity to have a feminist foreign policy after the experience of other global north countries and Mexico. So that being said, the pillars of this administration was the returning of multilateral spaces, which was called the turquoise foreign policy, which is the mix of the priority of climate change, climate justice, ocean protections, also one of our principles, which is human rights and feminist foreign policy. The main challenges were, of course, the culture, and I would like to talk about that after in the discussion with my fellow panelists. But the idea was to increase the representation of women in multilateral spaces. So now we have a record of women ambassadors, the 30%, which is very good news due to the masculine and patriarchal system around foreign policy, community, and foreign service. Another feature in our foreign policy is that it has 8 axes or dimensions. It's the first foreign policy in the world, feminist foreign policy in the world, to incorporate the care system. We have a national care system which recognize domestic labor as labor. So I think that is a great lesson that we can share with other countries, especially in Latin America. And another aspect that I would like to highlight, it's improve our presence in the world around technology, innovation, women in STEM, and we're working very closely with our Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation. Next, please. Thank you. So as you can see here, we have the 8 axes of feminist foreign policy. There are quite a lot. If you share and have you seen different comparative perspectives and different cases around the world in feminist foreign policies, they have just a few principles or highlights that those countries like to share, but we have 8. In my perspective, that's very positive, but it's quite challenging due to this administration has 4 years to complete this, so it's quite ambitious. We don't have the majority in our Congress. We're still dealing with a lot of opposition, especially in the what you can say ultra or far right wing. So one of our problem is that Chile has done a lot when it comes to gender equality and in its participation in different multilateral spaces, especially with other countries with feminist foreign policies or feminist foreign policies initiatives, especially with Spain and Mexico. But the problem is that we're still very I will say, in an initial phase, and especially the public are not very involved when it comes to feminist foreign policy. Still, it's seen as a woke agenda or gender ideology. And I think that one of our main challenge is how to communicate with people and civil society. as part of organized civil society in academia, in other foreign policies environments, we've been included in different discussions. Our country has an action plan. Next, please. So with my final remarks. So the feminist foreign policy was launched officially in June 2023. And last year for International Women's Day, this action plan was released. As you can see, has certain amount of goals, which are 3, and different areas or spaces when the feminine foreign policy wants to create change. I would love to highlight the consular space. So now we have a system against domestic violence and gender-based violence. So all the foreign service officials are being educated and now are receiving more tools in order to prevent and assist, especially women in danger. In our representations around the world, we also have an app, and the country have signed quite a few memorandum of understanding and different instruments with several countries to improve its presence internationally. Also, our country was a member of the Council of Human Rights in the UN. So we've been very supportive in women and children in Palestine, Afghanistan, Iran, and so on. So I can share this presentation when everyone who needs it. And next, please. My question, I know that we have different questions, but my main concern now in this year, we have presidential elections and bicameral elections in our Congress at the end of the year. It's the institutionalization of the feminist foreign policy in Latin America. The problem is that when you change the president, that leader may not have the initiative or the will to continue to deepen and broaden this this feminist foreign policy. If we've seen that in Argentina, next to our country, and I think it's a big threat for not only women's rights, but also for democracies in our region. So I would love to continue the conversation and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constanza, for your brief introduction into Chilean feminist foreign policy. I'm sure, like our audience, but as well me, we learned already a lot, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of food for thought to continue our discussion, especially maybe on the care system and how that's been implemented. I think that's one of the aspects was super interesting to me. And yeah, so we will briefly continue with the introduction presentation of Paulina. And let me briefly introduce Maria Paulina Rivera Chavez to you, who is a doctoral fellow in the research group Minor Cosmopolitanisms at the University of Potsdam in Germany. And her work focuses on the intersection of foreign policy, feminist, and decolonial theory. And she is also part of the Mexican network on feminist foreign policy, the Red Mexicana de Política Exterior Feminista, which advocates for an intersectional feminist foreign policy, and that also we, as the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation Mexico, is part of this network. And Paulina, prior to engaging in academia, she was an advisor to the Vice Minister for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Gender and Sustainable Development. And she holds a master's degree in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a bachelor's in international relations from El Colegio de México. And she identifies as a decolonial and queer feminist. And yeah, we're very pleased to have you here, and good afternoon, I think, to Potsdam, Germany.
Thank you very much, Sina. I'm very happy to be here today. And I will talk very briefly about the context of Mexico's feminist foreign policy. And then we can engage more in the discussion afterwards with just some very general lines. So as Constanza was explaining in the case of Chile, Mexico became the first country, and that is how it announced this policy as the first country of the global south, which we can then discuss what that means to adopt this policy. And this happened in 2020. And there is a lot of debate going on what a feminist foreign policy actually is. So I would just briefly say what the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs says its feminist foreign policy is, which is a set of principles to guide the government actions to reduce and eliminate structural differences, gender gaps, and inequalities. And the main goal of this policy is to build just and prosperous societies. So it's a big project that considers itself transformative, not only talking about gender equality and representation, but also talking about changing different structures of oppression. So it has 5 main goals, which it's a gender perspective or gender mainstreaming in multilateral forum. Some of the objectives are based on the work of the ministry itself, which is about parity and representation of women in diplomacy, the reduction and elimination of violence within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the protection of Mexicans abroad. And it's also about the visibilization of women in diplomacy throughout history. It also has a 5th goal, that it's intersectionality. And although it hasn't been widely explored, and it would be very relevant for the discussion afterwards, it is the first country to actually have a goal specifically addressing intersectionality. The development in recent years, as Mexico adopted this policy 5 years ago, I would say, and also drawing on what Constanza was sharing, with the idea of societies of care. In order to transform society, you need to understand the current structure and where inequality comes from. And care becomes fundamental within the project of feminist foreign policy for Mexico and for the region of Latin America and the Caribbean at the moment. And it's changing the way we understand care. And it is about who has the right to care, to receive care, how the care work is distributed within society, and also it's caring about the planet. So talking about climate change and the implications of climate change has been a topic also present in the project of feminist foreign policy. In the Forum Generation Equality that Mexico co-hosted with France, there was the creation of this global alliance for care, and then the Buenos Aires commitment a couple of years ago in 2022, which centers the idea of care as an important part of feminist foreign policy. Mexico also was the first country to host a ministerial level conference on feminist foreign policy that took place last year, and where a political declaration was negotiated. It's also part of some advocacy efforts of some networks, informal networks. We are talking about CSW, that it's taking place right now in New York. So it's part of the feminist foreign policy group with the goal of discussing with like-minded countries what a feminist foreign policy would look like. So those are some of the developments. I would like to just briefly conclude, like in these 30 seconds that I have left, just to say what my role is in these discussions. So I am doing a PhD trying to analyze Mexico's feminist foreign policy from a historical and epistemological perspective. So feminism as such is a social movement. So it is very interesting to try to understand what does it mean for a state and specific governments to have a feminist foreign policy. And these are the discussions I'm interested in as a researcher and also as part of the Mexican network on feminist foreign policy, and trying to think how a policy from the state can be intersectional, and yes, center gender equality in the policies, but also understand oppression in a historical and broader perspective, which is why categories such as the Global South become important as a site of contestation and epistemological conversations of understanding what are the legacies of historical processes that allows us to understand current inequalities and what are the actions that need to be taken in order to reach this goal of building just and prosperous societies. So I would finish here, and thank you very much for the opportunity of talking with all of you.
Thank you very much, Paulina. Yeah, and I think, yeah, thank you for addressing intersectionality as a key objective of a Mexican feminist foreign policy. And I think we already see like some topics overlapping with a case of Chile, as you both addressed the care, like right to care and care alliance in your presentation. So I'm sure there's going to be something to follow up on. But first, I would like to invite Bruna to share her perspective about feminist foreign policy initiatives in Brazil. And yes, Bruna Soares, Dr. Bruna Soares holds a PhD in political science, and she is currently a FAPERI Nota 10 postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of International Relations at PUC Rio in Brazil. And she conducts research and consultancy in the fields of feminist foreign policy and international cooperation. And Bruna is also one of the coordinators of the Brazilian Observatory of Inclusive Feminist Foreign Policy, called OPEFI. And yeah, we're happy to have you here, Bruna, and happy to listen about what you can tell us about Brazil.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to share this space with my colleagues. And I want to highlight the importance of this space for reflect the feminist foreign policy from Latin American perspective. I'm here first to share with you an overview about the agenda in Brazil, and listen to my colleagues. I think Brazil is an example of Constanza mentioned about the polarization and the issues that is to define the feminist foreign policy in a context of so many changes on domestic system of the Latin America countries. And you see this from a presentation about the gender agenda situation here across the democratic periods. In my view, Brazil, when compared to the others Latin America countries, still has a more modest trajectory when it comes to advancing the gender agenda. This reality helps explain our current situation regards the lack of official adoption of a feminist foreign policy under the President Lula's third administration. So I can say that since Brazil process of redemocratization, issues related to gender agenda have been highly polarized. In electoral contexts, women's sexual and reproductive rights are often used to create tension between candidates who support Christian values and those who do not only in the 2018 elections, which results in Bolsonaro victory, but even during Dilma Rousseff's first presidential campaign in 2010, the issue of abortion, for example, was mobilized to turn voters. This movement has progressively marginalized issues central to Brazil and Latin American feminisms, prevent left-leaning governments from fully committing to them. Therefore, when Lula won the 2022 elections, there were expectations that Brazil would take significant steps to institutionalize policies advocated by governments based, among that those championed by Brazilian feminist movements. Besides this situation, It's important to recognize, for instance, the creation of the position of High Representative for Gender Issues within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the formal institutionalization of the Association of Brazilian Women Diplomats, which in turn helped pave the way for other initiatives, such as the Inclusive Feminist Foreign Policy Observatory, which I coordinate alongside Professors Paula Drummond and Tamia Rebelo. Furthermore, Brazil has signed the Declaration for Latin American and Caribbean Feminist Foreign Policy, together with the countries represented by my fellow panelists here today. This is the current situation in Brazil. On one hand, we see efforts to more deeply integrate the gender agenda with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including close collaboration with the Ministry of Women, as demonstrated by how Brazilian delegation has been engaged at this very CSW. On the other hand, however, there remains resistance to adopt the term feminist to describe both foreign and domestic policy. I believe this is due to the high political cost of doing so at this moment, especially with the presidential elections approaching next year. Most of the progress, in this sense, achieved in recent years has come from civil society. I would particularly highlight the work of our observatory in producing studies that emphasize the potential and opportunities for Brazilian diplomacy to engage with the feminist agenda. We have also focused on shared knowledge about feminist foreign policy, whether by sharing news about Brazilian government actions on gender agenda or by going to the streets to understand what feminist foreign policy means for the women actively engaged in feminist movements within Brazil. There's still a long way to go, but despite our slow pace, I can say that in these past 4 years with the Lula election, we have been able to move forward again, because with Bolsonaro, we even can talk about a possibility to one day adopt a feminist foreign policy. And so I think here, as a representative of Brazil, I'm in a different position from my colleagues that are representing countries that already adopt a feminist foreign policy, but we can understand from the Brazil experience the complex, the different categories that we have to understand for a country, for a government, to call his foreign policy as a feminist foreign policy. So I would like to share my point of view from Brazil and from as a Latin American specialist. And thank you so much for this space.
Thank you very much, Bruna. And I think, yeah, I'm just so happy to have you with us to see like some of the obstacles maybe that countries are facing on their path towards implementing a feminist foreign policy. And yeah, especially pleased to have you as one of the activists from Brazil that's pushing for the implementation of a Brazilian feminist foreign policy. And I think, yeah, you addressed some very important and interesting points in terms of yeah, like real politics, how they interfere in terms of, like, for example, presidential elections and political costs and like backlashes in society. And yeah, so thank you very much for sharing that. And then we will move on to, last but not least, speaker Sophia Perez-Gil. And I will briefly introduce her to you. So Sophia Perez-Gil is a doctoral candidate in political studies at the University de Rosario in Bogota. And her research focuses on feminist theories of international relations, feminist foreign policy, and women's rights in their diversity. And as a consultant of the Colombian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, she was responsible for drafting the Colombian feminist foreign policy document and contributed to its implementation and dissemination at the national and international levels. She also contributed to the consolidation and work of the Observatory of Women, Peace and Security for Latin America and the Caribbean, which was responsible for creating knowledge and recommendations on peace and security in the region from a feminist, participatory, and intersectional perspective. So we're glad to have you with us, Sophia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sina, and thank you to FES Mexico for the invitation to speak here today. Thank you also to my colleagues who spoke before me and who have very successfully introduced what feminist foreign policy looks like in Latin America. So I have the luck of having been inside the process of Colombia's feminist foreign policy and not being in the ministry anymore, so I can tell you with complete honesty about how the process has been like and without the constraints of being a government representative, but in civil society at the moment. So Colombia's feminist foreign policy comes in a particular time in history for Colombia. We're having our very first left-wing and progressive government in history, and this has come with several agendas that the government is pursuing. So Colombia's feminist foreign policy adheres to these inclinations. So it has three pillars that guide its development. The first, it's that it's a intersectional foreign policy. The second, that it is participatory, and the third, that it is pacifist. So what we mean by intersectional is that the recognition of women's rights cannot be done without an understanding also on how race, ethnicity, rural living, for example, women who are farmers, who are fishers, experience gender inequality and violence. So these understandings of the differences have to be taken into account when we think about women's rights and women's improvement within society. And this thought of intersectionality as important to build Colombia's feminist foreign policy led us to think that our feminist foreign policy would have to be built under a participatory basis. So what this means is that Colombia's feminist foreign policy was constructed and built with the help of several organizations of women in the country who have been working for women's rights and the improvement of the condition of women's lives and well-being, in Colombia. And these reunions led us to choose the pillars of Colombia's feminist foreign policy, as we from the ministry had some expectations on what would be most important for women, but we were standing from a standpoint of being mostly white women, university-educated women, women who lived in the city, in the capital, in Bogota. So as we think of embodied knowledge and the knowledge that it takes to understand intersectional perspectives of being women and how the experiences of foreign policy are in women's lives, we thought that we would need different and diverse standpoints to build on the foreign policy. And these both intersectional and participatory understandings of foreign policy led us to have certainty that this foreign policy would have to be pacifist at its core. What this means is that this policy promotes peace at its core, and it promotes peace not only in understandings of positive peace as the absence of conflict, but also it showcases and highlights the participation of women in these processes and how this participation, which has been limited, women have been marginalized from peacemaking efforts. So this foreign policy aims to increasing the participation of women in peace agreements and showcasing how women participate in everyday peace. This foreign policy also comes at the same time as Colombia's first national action plan for the Women, Peace and Security resolution. We didn't have an action plan before, and this was because of the militarized nature of Colombian foreign policy before. We had a very internal conflict and drug policy-oriented foreign policy, which main goal was to contribute to the fight against drug trafficking and the fight against terrorism, in which Colombia included our internal conflict before. So that's why we didn't have any advances in national action plans for including women in peace and security and improving peace and security for women. So this process in the National Action Plan was also a participatory process. More than 1,500 women participated in building the National Action Plan, and they contributed on how they think peace and security would look like for women in the country. And it included a diverse set of opinions and understandings on peace and security for us. So both these processes, the feminist foreign policy and the National Action Plan, are contributing to improving the agenda of peace and security here for more humane understandings of security that are not only militarized, but that also include, for example, care agendas, the protection of the environment, peace with the environment, and biodiversity. And they're promoting these agendas multilaterally, bilaterally, and also at the consular level, with better consular attention for women abroad.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophia, for addressing
Sina, tu micrófono se cerró.
Oh, thank you very much, Elisa. So I was just wanting to share, big thank you to you as well, Sophia, for sharing very inspiring remarks about the Colombian feminist foreign policy in terms of the participatory process that led to it. And I think that's something I'm sure feminist foreign policies, but generally policy making globally can learn from. Okay, so I think we're moving on to our questions and little moderated discussion. So as you all, or some of you already hit on some challenges that your countries have been facing in the implementation or design of feminist foreign policies, I would like to ask you, what lessons have been learned in the implementation of feminist foreign policies in your countries, and what challenges, what obstacles are there, and maybe that's also something that's interesting for us to discuss. We have also Bruna present with representing the case of Brazil that has not yet adopted a feminist foreign policy. So we don't have a fixed order yet, so you can just jump in. Whoever wants to go first.
Maybe I can say some words because Brazil don't have not yet feminist foreign policy, but I'm not speaking only about Brazil, but about what we have been observing in countries that have already adopted a feminist foreign policy. In my opinion, the greatest challenge has been the lack of institutionalization of this policy as a state policy. I think maybe the key lesson we have learned in that when feminist foreign policy is treated just a government policy as a branding of a particular political group, it becomes extremely fragile and vulnerable to electoral shifts. We have the example of Argentina and Sweden. We have this tension in Canada now. I think we're not going to have the formula to send this, but I do believe that the first step is to confront the polarization of the feminist agenda and to reflect on how we can learn from countries that have already managed to institutionalize gender rights and consider how to do the same with the feminist policy. I think this is the major challenge for Brazil and other countries that don't have a feminist foreign policy, but it's still a problem to the countries that already have a feminist foreign policy, because as Chile, saw this with Mexico too in the past election. Every time you have election process, we have to pay attention what will happen with the feminist foreign policy. So I think we have to discuss more about how to institutionalize these policies.
I think Constantia, you want to go next?
Thank you. I also share some of the remarks that Bruna made. I think that the biggest challenges, especially in our countries in Latin America, is that I will say historically, but also by our colonial heritage and our history with other global powers, our culture is very rooted in I'll say strong leadership, like masculine type of leadership based on the macho culture, and also our democracies are very fragile. We have functional democracies. We can elect our representatives, but we don't have a citizen base, inclusive and, for example, multi-ethnic type of democracy. We don't have a very strong tradition in democracy, as, for example, in European countries that are also going through a very deep and profound and dangerous crisis when it comes to democracy. So I think that's the root of the problem. I'll say that due to polarization and the fact that most I'll say certain leaderships, more conservative leaderships, really weaponize the woke culture, woke agenda. So they vilify women as the villains of the story. So another thing that I think we need to take into consideration, according to that data, for example, Latino Barometro, is that younger generations are being more conservative. They're not very involved in democracy, and I think that we have in Chile at least this fatigue about freedom, about mobilization. I think that the pandemic and the social uprising, or estallido social, and the constitutional process happened at the same time. So was a time of hope, but afterwards it was very disappointing, and it was a lot of, I'll say, people were scared about the effects of the pandemic. And this new administration came with a lot of new progressive ideas that were also dealing with the fact that this leadership was very young for traditional standards in Chile. And now the agenda, the priorities of the agenda are immigration, security, and economic recovery. So feminism here is still a dirty word, even though we have a lot of activism. And for example, in International Women's Day March, we see so many women on the streets, and our feminist movements are very alive. But in the mainstream media, for example, you can see a lot of this conservative voices being more and more mainstream. And I think another problem is social media. So and another problem is that when it comes to human rights, women and children's rights, and all type of progressive policies are seen by the public as a domain of the left wing. So we also have a very anti-communist heritage as well. So for me, the main challenge is to create legal and institutional basis and roots so the feminist foreign policy can advance even the government change for another type of leadership on another political part of the spectrum. That is one thing. Also, to approach to people who are not convinced, because I think here we're very convinced about the need and the importance of a feminist foreign policy, but I think that we need to be more pragmatic when it comes to show with data the benefits to have a feminist foreign policy, especially for countries, and to share the word with my fellow panelists. I think that we need to share how we can create maybe a Latin American approach to feminist foreign policy, because I agree with Paulina that the global South perspective, it's very useful in some cases, but at the same time, it's kind of like a vacuum that you can put everything on it. But a lot of governments use feminist foreign policy as pink washing or nation branding, and as you can see in the case of Mexico.
I think Paulina wants to add something as well.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, because I find the comments of my colleagues very interesting, and I think, let me see how I like to phrase this, but there is a lot of analysis that it's very important to understand what feminism is doing to foreign policy. What are the advantages of calling your foreign policy feminist, and also which are the challenges that we're talking. But I think another question that we need to ask ourselves is what foreign policy is doing to feminism. And by this, what I mean, and talking about challenges, is and referring to the idea of branding and pink washing, is not only understanding that there are different feminisms, but what does this mean when we address specific ideas within the project? When we talk about gender equality, where are we coming from? What is gender? Which are the colonial legacies behind our understanding of gender today? Equality for whom? In which way? If we continue centering the notion of women in the agenda, women, only women, women representation, visibility, and then adding other categories of this hegemonic ideal of womanhood, then that's a big challenge. And that is why the project of feminist foreign policy can be very valuable as a point of departure for many discussions that we need to happen on how global politics is founded on notions of masculinity, for example, but also becomes very problematic framing, not only from anti-right movements or conservative movements, but even for feminist movements in the world, saying there is a cooptation by governments for specific purposes of our social demands that we don't see translated into the everyday. It is important to have more representation of women in diplomacy, for example, but how does this translate in this transformative project of what it entails to do? So for me, that is the biggest challenge. If we are going to talk about a feminist foreign policy from the global South, from the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, if we are going to talk about intersectionality, it has to be a very wide discussion that it's with a lot of participation, but also opening up the very ideas at the core. It's not only saying we invite many organizations and activists to discuss gender equality, but to discuss the very subject behind these policies. When we talk about intersectionality, we don't talk about women and race, women and class, but oppression as intertwined. And that is very, very important. That's a challenge because I haven't seen in the practice how this notion plays out in the feminist foreign policy. So just like to conclude, this important framing is under attack, yes, by anti-gender movements, but also by social movements that are claiming our demands are being co-opted. So we need to understand this, and it's like a very, very important challenge that I see in all feminist foreign policies, the Mexican included.
Okay, I think Sophia wants to add something, and then we had like foreseen to continue a bit this moderated discussion, but I already see there's a lot of questions on the floor of our participants. So I think maybe we're gonna close the moderated discussion after this question, and then move on to have an open discussion if you allow. So please, Sophia.
Thank you. Following on what Paulina was saying, in Colombia, there has been this discussion about the co-opting of the feminist movement within the government, which has amplified a discussion on how the feminist movement and feminist activism has to dialogue and intersect with the government. And this has led to different positions on how we as feminists should interact with the government. Some saying that feminism should be a non-partisan movement, that it should be secluded from government positions, and some others saying that we have to negotiate with very patriarchal and hierarchical institutions such as the state. And this has led to interesting conclusions. I am, for instance, convinced that feminism has to dialogue with the state, as the state concentrates the resources on the legitimate use of violence, and it is the only means of allocating these resources into things that interest women in their diversities. But I also understand the criticism towards women who participate within the state and uphold these hierarchical and violent structures that uphold women, violence against women and oppression towards women. So I think giving foreign policy the last name of feminist has held foreign policy to a higher standard, particularly in Colombia. The feminist movement is very critical of the state, and we have upheld the government into incredibly high standards, which have had consequences, for instance, in how we view drug policy, in how we understand security, and also in who represents Colombia as diplomats and who represents Colombia as ministers. We have had cases of ambassadors and councilmen who have been violent against women, and the criticism they have received had never seen before. We have never seen before this amount of criticism, and that is because giving the foreign policy this nickname of feminist holds it to a higher standard than not naming it with the nickname. So when we do name our foreign policy as feminist, we are holding it to the standard of what it means to be feminist and what feminist coherence means. And this has led to interesting and different ways of understanding drug policy, security, environmental policy, and other aspects of foreign policy, because we also maybe are seeing that feminist foreign policy is reduced to women and women's rights, right? But I think when you call your foreign policy feminist, you're saying that you're gonna guide your foreign policy through feminist principles in all of its thematics and all of its instances. And I think feminists, at least in Colombia, are holding the government very tightly to this new standard of what a feminist foreign policy should look like. And this has guided decision-making into places that we had never seen before. For instance, we are having debates on drug policy at the United Nations that we had never had before. We're having discussions on environmental policy that we had never had before. We're having discussions on the rights and particular rights of indigenous and Afro-Colombian women in multilateral instances as we had never seen before, and also about peace and going against genocide, violence against civilians, violations to humanitarian law. And these are all, I think, consequences of this new standard that foreign policy is being held up to in Colombia.
Yeah. So thank you very much for sharing these insights about obstacles. So for sure, there are quite a lot, but I'm very happy to see that we're all like working towards more just policies and to really make like the feminist, as you call it, nickname, Sophia, to make that like a reality, right? And not just the pinkwashing as Constanza called it. I think also Constanza has to leave us soon. That's correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Couple minutes.
Okay,
so
so
sorry. I apologize.
yes, no worries. So I've seen that there are already some questions in the chat, but I would really prefer to have like interventions, maybe like personally, to engage more with our audience and to maybe see also some of the faces and connect better. So I would really invite you to pose a question. You can like lift your hand and we will see if we go one question by one question, or if we want to collect if there's many. So maybe, just a last chance if you have a question in particular for Constanza, that would be the time now. And so I open the floor for the questions from the audience. And if you want to, if you can, please open your cameras. That would be nice as well. I think there was a question or several, I think, from Sarah Forero Bastamante. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Maybe you want to go first. But there was also a question of Anais Pulgar. You want to jump in? As you open your camera already, I felt like you're ready to speak. Otherwise, I can also read out the questions of the chat. But, don't be shy, please.
Yeah, I can go. Thank you.
Yes.
So I think you've been discussing this a little bit, but I was wondering, given the political processes that we are facing, the backlashes, the presidents who are particularly opposed to gender issues, in Colombia, there has been also different movements within the government and oppositions against the government of fragmentation. What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of explicitly framing these foreign policies as feminist or using the nickname as you were mentioning? And what could be strategies to pursue the same objectives while mitigating the resistance caused by the language? And I do believe that language creates realities. So would this be desirable, or do you think it will represent a kind of failure for feminisms? Thank you.
So do we have another question that we want to add, or Anais Pulgar? You can open the microphone. Okay, so we go back to the chat in a little while, but maybe already our panelists want to respond to the question by Sarah. In terms of the advantages and disadvantages of calling foreign policy feminist. Paulina.
I could say something, and then I see also Maria Daniela Delgado that maybe has a question, but like just very briefly because it's a very interesting question. So definitely using the word feminism can be problematic in certain conversations. I'm thinking in the case of Mexico at the moment, addressing a topic of foreign policy with the United States, for example, at this moment, or with the government of the US, probably using the word feminism won't be, strategically speaking, a good strategy, for example. So what I would say is it's not only about talking the plurality of feminisms, but understanding which type of feminism you are defending. So you could talk about equality of all people, like not just gender equality, or you can have an anti-patriarchal or anti-colonial, for example, foreign policy. So if you use feminism as a point of departure, you need to explain what does this mean, and not equate only feminism to women's rights, because that can be, to a certain extent, a bit alienating in certain spaces, or even like talking about gender ideology, but basically saying what you're standing for. And I see last year in the ministerial conference on feminist foreign policy, how Bolivia, for example, was referring to, yes, an anti-patriarchal and intersectional foreign policy. So yeah, I would just like leave it here, I guess, because yeah, feminism can be problematic in certain contexts, and it is about which are the ideas behind the concept of feminism that you are defending that you have to sort of explain.
Thank you, Paulina. So I would add the question of Anais, and then maybe we can like collect a bit of the questions and then go back to the panelists to respond. So Anais is as far as I understand, it's a follow-up question in terms of the discussion we had on the setbacks or obstacles. So how can we institutionalize feminist foreign policies, especially when there are no mechanisms for the advancement of women due to strong hierarchical structures? So maybe you can keep that in mind. And then I would give the floor to Maria Daniela Delgado.
Hi, thank you very much. So Sofia was mentioning that in this government, I'm from Colombia too, we have the first feminist foreign policy, and also the first time ever that the resolution 1325 has been ever regulated into an action plan. And I would like to ask her, how do these two initiatives come together in practice? Thank you.
And we have Louis Lacey.
Buenos días o buenas tardes a todos y todas. Mi nombre es Luz Lacey, integro Feministas Sin Fronteras, que es una organización, una asociación civil de la República Argentina. Está presidida por Marita Perceval, que en nuestro país, Marita, durante el gobierno anterior, fue la representante especial para la política exterior feminista, y desde ese lugar, que integraba la estructura del Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores, llevó adelante una estrategia de institucionalización de la política exterior feminista, sin perjuicio de lo cual, a sabiendas de lo que configura el gobierno actual nacional a cargo de Javier Milei, y en un marco y una estrategia de retroceso de derechos de las mujeres, de las niñeces, las adolescencias y las diversidades, un poco la pregunta iba en torno a, habiendo identificado la dificultad para institucionalizar en los países de América Latina y el Caribe la política exterior feminista, ¿cuáles creían que, más allá de los planes de acción a nivel nacional, creían que podían ser estrategias, mencionando uno o dos, pero estrategias que pudieran darse los países a nivel regional para fortalecer esas políticas exteriores una vez que se gestionan los gobiernos, para que se conviertan en políticas de Estado que sea más difícil poder derribar o desaparecer. De alguna manera, en la actualidad nosotros no contamos con política exterior feminista. Entonces, ¿cuáles consideran que son elementos clave? O, bueno, en algún momento se habló de marcos jurídicos institucionales que puedan blindar el establecimiento de las políticas exteriores feministas, pero cuáles consideran elementos claves sobre los cuales deberíamos trabajar desde los activismos feministas, desde las representaciones de gobiernos feministas, desde las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, en clave interseccional, pero también colectiva, para ir fortaleciendo esta política desde la perspectiva del sur global y de América Latina y el Caribe en su integralidad. Muchas
Thank you so much. Is there any of the panelists who want to start responding to the 3 questions? Sophia, go ahead, please.
Okay, so I think there are 2 questions that are very similar and another one that is a little bit different. So I'm gonna start by answering how we can mitigate backlash and what strategies do we have to strengthen feminist foreign policy. I actually do not believe that using the word feminist is going to make the policies more fragile in the face of adversity and in the face of opposition. I think right-wing movements and anti-right movements do not care what word we use. We are seeing this in the case of the United States, where, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion are being used as a term to name everything related to gender, everything related to race, everything related to class structures. So I do not think the word feminists matters as much as we think it does in the face of anti-right movements. These movements are coming strong to erase the advances in women's rights, the rights of indigenous peoples, the rights of racialized peoples, and anything close to bringing class hierarchies and structures down. They are going to try to weaken these advances and to remove resources from these movements. So I think the use of the word feminism is not going to be of any difference when they come. We have seen, for example, that the Department for Women and Justice in the US State Department has been extremely defunded, and they talk about women and not about feminism. So I don't really think this is going to make a difference. I do think when it comes to these movements, there have to be very strong legal and constitutional structures that protect these sort of movements. For instance, we saw in France, they included sexual and reproductive rights into the constitution. And this is to blind these rights and to make them more strong and stronger in the face of adversity and foreseeing that we might have political changes towards the right in the future. I think these are the this is the influence that the feminist movement has been having in Latin America for the last few years. We have had advances, particularly in the sexual and reproductive agenda. And we have had, for instance, in Colombia, we removed abortion up until the 24th week from our penal code. It is no longer a crime as it was before. And there are still advances that we have to be making. And this is a strategy that has both institutional feminists, lawyers, judges, women working within the frame of the legal arena. And we also have civil movements on the streets. We have direct action. We have women enforcing pressure and making these subjects urgent for the government. So I do think we have to blind these advances in feminist, not feminist rights, but women's rights, the rights of indigenous peoples, the rights of racialized peoples, the rights of farmers and fishers, and that these rights have to be both protected by the Constitution. For instance, in Colombia, they are protected by the Constitution. We cannot have any sort of discrimination as per our Constitution, even if they erase the advances in policy. They cannot make us go backwards in the rights we have already achieved if we blind them and if we make them strong enough. We cannot conceal our policies by calling them a different name. They are still going to go after them. Even if we call them a different name, even if we conceal them within another policy, if we call them inclusion, if we call them equality, if we call them diversity, they're still going to be erased by this anti-rights movement because that's their cause. So I do think we have to strengthen these legal instruments we have for the protection of our rights. It is not enough to have achieved them if they have the possibility of being erased, and we have to make them permanent and permanently written into our constitutions, into our legal codes, into our penal codes, so we do not have the ease and the possibility of them being erased for populism or for right-wing populism, as we are seeing, for instance, in the United States and in Argentina.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for sharing like the importance of institutionalizing women's rights to make them less fragile whenever like right-wing forces take over in our governments. Maybe like adding or linking to what Constanza previously said about the fragility of democracies and what we also even see in Europe, even after long years maybe of democratic history of countries, we still have like this right-wing backlash, and we kind of have to protect our progressive policies against that. So maybe Bruna or Paulina, you want to add something?
Bueno, si puedo avanzar un poco, me voy para el español porque me siento más confortable, si me permite. Pensando un poco en lo que la colega comentaba, yo creo que para institucionalizar el tema del feminismo y de las políticas feministas, sean internacionales o domésticas, creo que necesitamos, antes de todo, pasar por un proceso de enseñanza, de alfabetización, porque la polarización empieza en las calles también. El término feminismo no solo es un problema para quien está en el poder, pero es utilizado como una estrategia de amenazamiento a la población. Bueno, siempre tomo el ejemplo de Brasil, cuando todo lo que estaba en el paquete de feminismo, derechos de la salud sexual y reproductiva de la mujer, fue movilizado particularmente en las redes sociales, en una narrativa de miedo, de que en ese momento llegaría al poder a determinadas personas que sacarían todos los valores familiares y cristianos. Y bueno, por no entender bien lo que significa los feminismos, la variedad, lo que definimos, es más fácil para que la población en general compre esas ideas de la estrategia de medio que vemos con el tema del cambio climático, con tantas otras agendas, y que ahí se avanza más con el negacionismo y todo lo que vemos ahí que representa, sea en Trump en Estados Unidos, sea en Bolsonaro y su grupo político aquí en Brasil. Entonces, si no hablamos, si no conversamos, si no educamos la población de base sobre los beneficios de las políticas feministas y los prejuicios de políticas que no están mirándolo para la diversidad, para la interseccionalidad, ahí siempre vamos a estar en esta condición de instabilidad, porque en un momento se vencen las elecciones un grupo político más progresista y ahí avanzamos un poquito más. En otro momento la extrema derecha gana las elecciones y retrocedemos como 20, 30 años y nunca logramos lo básico. Yo veo eso por un lado. Si queremos institucionalizar como una política de Estado, es un proceso a largo plazo. No vamos a lograr eso en 2, 3, 4 años. Necesitamos hablar, no alejar la gente que piensa diferente. Creo con ese tema de la polarización creamos nuestras burbujas y ahí nos vamos, solo queremos hablar y conversar con la gente que piensa igual. No, necesitamos conocer qué te da miedo. ¿Por qué tenés miedo del feminismo? ¿Por qué tenés miedo de eso? Porque a veces la gente ni siquiera sabe por qué tiene miedo de las políticas feministas. Son historias que son contadas muchas veces y se tornan verdad. Entonces creo que de ahí con la población es por donde podemos empezar el cambio político más a largo plazo. Y otro tema que es eso, que no es otro tema, pero es siguiendo un poco esta reflexión. Bueno, aquí en Brasil tenemos un serio problema en abordar el feminismo, incluso por los actores más progresistas. Aún es caro asumir una postura feminista. Muchas veces lideresas y líderes políticos están ahí hablando de cuestiones que defendemos del movimiento de base feminista, pero están llamando de igualdad de género porque ahí se permite que se debata en un contexto de Congreso Nacional o dentro del Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores. Para lo que vimos desde el observatorio, en nuestra experiencia incluso de nombrar el observatorio, por no, aún en Brasil no tenemos una política declaradamente feminista en ningún tipo de nivel, sería más fácil para nosotras si dijésemos que, bueno, es un observatorio de política para la igualdad de género que para la política feminista. Entonces, aún yo veo que aún estamos en este pasos atrás justamente por eso, porque la gente tiene miedo de la palabra y no solo la gente de que mi vecino o un colega que no trabaja con este tema, pero la gente que está en el poder, por más que sean personas que defendan y que crean que es necesaria una política feminista, aún así no la asumen porque es caro políticamente hoy en Brasil, por ejemplo, decir que el gobierno hace política feminista. Antes de las elecciones, el grupo de oposición al gobierno actual siempre en la media de manera general hablaba que a lo largo de los gobiernos Lula y Dilma, Brasil tenía una política exterior ideologizada. Esto porque se valoraba más una política voltada para el sur global, de cooperación con Latinoamérica, con países de África. Entonces, imaginen que solo por una valorización de la cooperación sur-sur ya se decía que era una política ideologizada. Entonces, si llamamos esta política de feminista, no sé lo que va a pasar en los medios de comunicación aquí en Brasil. Y bueno, como el gobierno estaría mucho más limitado en términos de avanzar la agenda. Entonces, yo vuelvo a mi punto inicial de mi respuesta. Si no hablamos, si no conversamos, si no educamos, si no explicamos lo básico, no podemos lograr lo que queremos lograr. Creo que estamos saltando etapas. Tenemos que volver un poco y pensar cómo accesar a estas personas, porque si es cuestión de clase, si es cuestión de geografía interna de los países, por qué determinadas personas tienen miedo, no entienden la validad y la importancia de pensar políticas feministas, políticas interseccionales, políticas de diversidad. Entonces ahí sí creo que sería posible, poquito a poquito, baby steps, a construir un proceso de institucionalización más estructurante, digamos así, para asumir políticas domésticas e exteriores feministas. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Bruna. I don't know if someone was in line to add something. No, we're good. So I think there was another question on YouTube, but I don't know if there's one here in the room still pending. That's not the case, then yeah, we will soon wrap it up to not take too much of your time because it's already 10, but I'm sure there would be more issues to discuss. So maybe just one question that was posted on the YouTube streaming in terms of the tension between feminism and the state and foreign policy. Do you think the tension within foreign policy is different than the tension? I think there's a mistake in the writing. Is it fair to characterize it as pinkwashing, or to think of foreign policies not as feminist, but rather as gender mainstreaming? I think maybe that would be a good question to wrap up this discussion.
So maybe I can say something about it. I don't know if my internet is working because it was a bit unstable, but yeah, let me know. So I think that connects a bit with the question that Luz Lacey was also posing, and it is about when we are creating regional alliances, for example, what are we talking about? If we call a policy from the state feminist, and we are doing gender mainstreaming, which is something we have been discussing, then I think the challenge that remains is how do we create alliances, like from these struggles? So what we need to understand, and I think what is important, and that for me it's the difference between a gender mainstreaming and rethinking the way we relate to each other, the way we want to build the societies that we are living, has to do with the type of alliances that we are creating regionally and with like trans-regionally, transnationally. And it is about understanding how interconnected all our struggles are. It is not only about acknowledging that gender equality, it's important for all states and for all governments, but how gender is embedded in a notion of humanity that has a specific history that continues to exclude a very important part of the people living in this planet. That the idea of humanity and citizenship have specific limitations. And in order to construct a policy that creates alliances, as I was saying, between governments, but between movements, we need to understand that gender, it's not the point of departure, but it explains a broader system of oppression. And a policy that it's based on different alliances and it's based on some principles of feminism, for example, decolonial feminism, anti-capitalist, anti-racial feminism, then we need to understand that it is important to denounce, for example, colonialism, ongoing genocides, inequality, poverty, to create these alliances. That goes way beyond talking about gender mainstreaming from the state and advocating for women representation in international organizations and in diplomacy. So that is how I see connecting this. Yes, if we are only focusing on gender and women as the subject of these policies, then I wouldn't call them feminist. I would call them gender mainstreaming. Yeah. I would conclude with this.
Thank you very much, Paulina, for sharing. And maybe, yeah, that's a good final input to stress the importance of alliances, to see how we're all united in the struggle for feminist foreign policies, and to really like hold governments accountable, how Sophia, I think, expressed it, as, I guess that's our task as a critical civil society, to make sure it's not a pinkwashing, but that actually governments do implement policies that can go with this name and not just focus on gender parity or like bringing more women to diplomatic spaces, because I think that's just a very small part of the struggle we're fighting. Thank you very much to our panelists. Constanza, as I said, already had to leave us because she's giving classes and very busy academic in Chile. But thank you so much for Sophia, Bruna, and Paulina. I know your schedules are also extremely busy, so thank you so much for being with us and sharing your experiences and all the insights from your countries. I think it was a very insightful discussion that I hope we will continue in the future. Let's explore what kind of ways we can use to connect more. And I'm sure there's going to be various opportunities to do so this year. Also, like running up to the conference in Paris that you were already mentioning, to bring like Latin voices to Paris, to the conference. And so very thankful for this discussion today. Also, a big thanks to my colleague Irma Delgado for organizing all of this, for managing the Zoom. And very big thanks as well for the simultaneous interpretation. I hope we didn't make it too hard for you and we're not talking too fast. So a big thanks go to Erica Benton and Roman Villar, and also to Moss Productions and Macros, I think, for the transmission, like for the live stream that we had on YouTube and Facebook. So everyone who's following us on the live stream and who's been staying until the end, thank you so much for tuning in. And big thank you. Yes, I don't know if anyone wants to add some goodbyes, but yes, so hope to continue this dialogue, and yes, big thanks and goodbye from Mexico City.